I would like to start with just having you introduce yourself and tell us about your involvement with FDF.
Okay, so my name is Robbi Shulman, and I am currently a judge at FDF on and off since 1998. I think, is that right? Yeah. Before that, I directed a group at St. Catherine's in Redondo Beach for 8 years, so that was from 88 to 96. And before that, I danced in a dance group called Panegyri with a few other people who have been interviewed today.
Right.
Directed by Fotini's husband and co-directed by George Nichols, who you'll be interviewing at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Danced with Ann Sirota. And my involvement with Greek dancing started at the Intersection, run by Ethan Karras, beginning probably in the early 70s.
And are you from Greece?
I am not Greek. I'm Xeni. I'm Xeni, foreigner, stranger, an outsider, not Greek, but stinkardiamu, which means in my heart. I'm close to Greek.
How did you get involved with?
I tell this story all the time. I have folk dance really probably since summer camp. And when I came to the Intersection, I did international dancing. The Intersection ran 7 nights a week, and Thursday and Sunday were Greek nights, and Balkan was on Wednesday, and International was on Friday, Armenian was on Tuesday, Israeli was on Monday. And at the time that I came back to the Intersection after I graduated from college, I was working in a residential treatment center. And I was a house parent, which meant you lived in with the group that you were working with. And my schedule was such that I lived in 4 days and then I was off 4 days. And what that meant is when I got back into dancing, when I went back to the Intersection, because I used to go back in the 60s even before I went to college, I was going on different nights. So I started out doing a lot of Balkan International, but then if I was off Thursday through Sunday,
You did whatever.
I was at a Greek night on Thursday and a Greek night on Sunday. And one of the things that happened almost instantly on the Greek nights was this sense of welcoming. So if you're doing a sirto, you may be brand new, and all of a sudden somebody drags you up to be at the front of the line in sirto. And it was very welcoming. I loved the music, I loved the energy, I loved the dancing. And I had loved the Balkan dancing too. And you can do essentially that dancing in Greek dancing, because Macedonian and Thracian dancing we did on Balkan nights, but you called it Bulgarian and you called it, Serbian or Croatian or what, Macedonian, sort of Slavic Macedonian. But in that dance environment, it was a little bit more rigid. And if you got into a line, for example, and you didn't quite know the dance, they didn't make you feel very welcomed. So it was a qualitatively different experience that drew me in really quickly. And then there was a dance group, and I was invited to join the dance group. And so it's kind of down that funnel. You start getting more and more involved. And after dancing in the dance group at the Intersection for a year, we ended up, for a variety of reasons, leaving with Nick and George and forming Panegyri, and no longer danced with the Intersection. So, and then this was from the mid-70s to the mid-80s. And at that time, there were not big dance programs in the church. So we performed at all of these churches that we then later went to teach in.
I think that's incredible how that started
So
out.
it really
So what did
kind of
happen with
evolved.
Intersection? I've never heard.
I don't really have a lot to say about that.
Okay.
I think that when the move was made, we were kind of PNG, persona non grata, for a while back at the Intersection. Not for me to say. It was not,
Yeah,
I don't have
doesn't
personal history with it, but we just kind of moved away from it.
What's the difference, kind of off topic, what's the difference in international dance and folk dance? I mean, you made a distinction, it sounded like.
I think international just meant it was dancing from all different
countries.
yeah.
Yeah.
So if you did an international dance night, they did some Balkan, some Greek, some Armenian, polka here and there. So it was more of a mix.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So as you were teaching, you were traveling around teaching at the different parishes or churches.
So I didn't travel around so much, but what happened is after our group disbanded in '86, and FDF had churches that wanted dance groups, there weren't as many Greeks in the Greek churches that knew a lot of the dancing. I don't know if you Fotini mentioned.
She did, yeah.
But when she grew up in Greece, she danced in her PE classes like once a week or every other day, but didn't necessarily know the breadth of dances that we had ended up having experience with. So of our dance group, there were maybe 6 or 7 people who ended up teaching in various churches.
And how many dances did you know at that point? There were, like Greek dances. There's just so
I don't know how many dances, but our performing group did dance. We had suites from Crete and from Thrace, Macedonian suites, island suites. So I've certainly learned much more since, but I mean, we had a pretty broad range of dances. It was Anne's ex-husband who brought me to St. Catherine's to interview to be the director there. Mike,
okay.
yeah. And the director, or the president of the dance board, and I don't remember her name, the president of the dance board was, I think, originally from New York. And we were talking, and she actually grew up as a Greek in a predominantly Jewish area in New York. And here I was, Jewish, and coming to teach in the Greek church. I was like, what are you doing here? Well, what were you doing there?
What are you doing here? Yeah, really.
So that was my intro to teaching at St. Catherine's.
When did you learn the Greek language? It sounds like you
I
speak some Greek? Or?
I have picked up a lot by osmosis and have been to Greece 4 times. And before I went the first time, I took language classes for about 6 months and then took them again. And I think that maybe when I retire, I will take language classes and hopefully it'll stick.
Well,
so I speak some, I understand some.
And what do you do for a living?
I'm a social worker.
Okay. Remember that
I work
too.
at a community mental health center.
Well, yeah, if you were in a residential
Right,
care facility, that makes sense.
right.
So how were those early years with FDF?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you ask that, what my career is, because as a social worker, I think I really used, I think it's just inherent in me because I was also I came out of a summer camp world and was kind of camp counselor and really was into sort of group work, so to speak. And I think it was really, the groups that I had were really important to me, and having them be cohesive as a group and to care about each other. And even though FDF was in part about the competition, I always played down the competition, wanted the kids in the group to really love what they were doing because I was passionate about it.
Yeah.
And to be able to tolerate the winning or losing because it was not the most important thing. So for me, to be able to teach and convey my passion about dancing was something that I really enjoyed.
Kind of brought all of that together. Your career, your love of dance.
And getting sort of being able to be sort of an outsider and yet embraced by a community. The dance board and the parents, for the most part, were very supportive. There was a cadre of moms who were from Greece who were really invested in the costumes for the kids. And so there was a lot of support. And I mean, at this point, when you think about it over time, I mean, some of the kids that I started with are now in their 30s and they're married and they have kids dancing. And it's the cycle is, I think, what has come of FDF and the way it's grown.
Do you see that continuing?
I do. Mm-hmm. I do. I see the investment of the kids that I taught who are now the parents of kids, and they're incredibly invested in having it be a part of their kids' lives.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that's for the camaraderie as much as the dancing or the religious, or can you even weight those at all?
You know, I think that it was very savvy on the part of FDF and on the part of the Met to have the youth ministry as a way to keep kids in the church, embracing and using the culture to have the kids stay involved. Because I'm not Orthodox, if you ask me which is more important, you know, I obviously came to it through the culture. It's not for me to say.
But I think it sounds like a lot of people come in that way. Kids especially.
Yes.
They love the dance and then they embrace the whole.
Well, I think depending, I mean, if kids start young, it's their parents that really start them. And for the older kids that come to it, obviously, I mean, they love it and it's...
Yeah.
But I think there's both. I mean, I think there are kids for whom the dancing and the cultural stuff is really primary, and there are other kids who really do integrate both.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about judging because you're an experienced judge. Kind of what's your approach? I've learned that different judges have kind of different ideas about judging.
Yeah. I think it may have evolved over the years. But how can I talk about a philosophy of judging? I mean, I am, because as much as I have a really broad knowledge of dancing, I am not a highly specific judge of particular steps and particular styles. And I think that the development of FDF and the research that the judges or the directors now do, who are now Greek and from the communities, and they can go to Greece and they can speak the language and they can listen to the interviews and they can read the books. I mean, they're much more specific in some of their research, and so I can't necessarily say that I know the details of this particular nuance from this Thracian chorio to this Thracian chorio. But the sense of sort of an overall feel of it, the overall quality of it, I tend to look at. I also tend, for example, to look at the integration of all the kids in a group, as opposed to only having the best dancers perform or certain dancers perform. And I mean, knowing that from having been a director and having had diversity in my groups, of having some really strong dancers and having some guys that just, you know, they had to be there, or they kind of wanted to be there and enjoyed it, but they were not dancers at heart. But that was our group, and everybody had to pull together to be part of that group.
It must have been satisfying when they became a group and did a good job.
It was satisfying to me, and it always pleases me to see how many of those kids are still involved and still, or even if they're not involved, have really good memories of those times.
Yeah, you must get a lot of satisfaction out of that.
Yeah.
Is there anything that's really evolved about the judging, or that you would like to evolve or change?
One of the things clearly that has evolved, both in terms of the directors and the judges, is as kids have grown up through the program and have then become directors themselves, a good almost half of the judging panel now are kids who have come up through the program.
Mm-hmm.
And I think on the one hand, there are benefits to having sort of the old judges that have a long view and a fairly broad view of what's gone on, and these really young, knowledgeable, experienced directors who are now judges on the panel. And I think that's the evolution. It has to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all of the kids that are eventually, I say kids, they're all in their 30s now, but they're going to be the judges as years go on.
Right.
And I think that's the evolution that has happened.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Well, they're very educated now too about the dances. Do you ever have guest judges? This is just me kind of throwing that out.
Well, there have been judges who've been brought from Greece.
Right. That's
Several
what I mean.
times.
No,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is really, it has been very rich. Some of them have done really well with it. Some of them maybe a little bit differently. But it's been really rich to have them. I think it would be wonderful to sort of continue that.
Is that being continued now, or was that something in the past?
I can't remember
Is
the
it
last
just kind
time.
of random when they...
Yeah, it hasn't been for the past. My memory is not great, so I can't say. Maybe the past couple of years.
All the
I don't
years
know.
blur together.
I don't know how long it's been. It does blur after a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That just went. There was something else I wanted to ask about Greece. Oh, there aren't as many directors going to Greece. At least they're not being sent by FDF.
They're not being sent by FDF,
They're going.
but I think most of the directors, I mean, it starts out with their family where they go to Greece during the summers, and a good number of the higher level directors go to Greece and do their own research. They either go to the workshops in Greece or they go on their own to areas that they're interested in and do some really sophisticated research. I mean, I would not say it's the majority, but at the higher levels, in the upper levels, the upper division levels, there are some directors who are really seeking out information and going and doing it on their own. And especially in the upper division, directors are asked to submit their research.
That's great.
So.
One thing I haven't asked anyone about today is that component where the dancers were also the management group, which went on years ago, I guess, but doesn't happen that way anymore. Where I think it was very early when they were in charge of budgets, they booked the hotels, those kinds of things, and then that, if I'm understanding right, that doesn't take place anymore.
I think, see, that's not really my area, so I don't have as much information about it. But I think that on the management team now, most of those people danced. They may not be dancing now, but they were dancers at one time.
Oh, okay. I'm meaning more that the students who came in as dancers when they were young were put on like a board, or they were actually managing FDF as kids. But maybe you don't have experience with...
Well, I know. I mean, I don't know, and I don't have that much experience or information with that. I do know that, I mean, when Peter was around and it was almost like a management training experience for these kids, which was pretty amazing. I mean, it could have been challenging. It was challenging sometimes if certain things didn't run quite that smoothly. But in terms of a growth experience for these kids, it was an amazing experience. So,
and that
I think I don't think that's done now. I mean, it is kids that have, again, I keep saying kids, young adults that have come out of FDF that are on the board now. But I don't know quite how the grooming goes on anymore.
Okay.
It's really not my area. Don't quote me on that one.
No, I just realized I hadn't talked to anyone
Yeah.
about that. It's not like a big point, but
Yeah.
in terms of, I had said it out there that I was asking about Kefi,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd kind of be interested to hear your definition of that, maybe in terms of the work you do in your group, in terms of a group, and what that word means.
Well, and it's funny because as judges, we write comments to the directors. And one of the things that I think I said in one of my comments this time was, again, Kefi isn't yelling oppa, it is relating to the people you're dancing with, looking at each other, interacting with each other, sort of feeling, like expressing yourself within the group, that is Kefi. It's not a show, it's what you experience with each other.
That's a good definition. I like that. Can you also describe, and this is probably tougher, but if there are any movements that show that somebody feels the dance more than they're just doing the steps? Are there any physical?
You know it when you see it.
Okay.
You know it when you see it.
Okay.
I mean, there's no particular move. I mean, it isn't necessarily the most graceful or the most perfect, best dancer.
Mm-hmm.
It's that they feel it.
That's great. If in thinking about making this video, if there's one thing or several things that you'd like to communicate, or the video to communicate, or to make sure we don't leave out, and if you want to think about this and email me, that would be great too. But
given that I tend to be impulsive and just say things, I don't have anything off the top of my head. I think that hearing about this project and thinking about it as a process, I think that maybe we can think and talk about it more. One of the things that I said earlier when we were talking in the group, and I asked Peter if he was going to interview Tony, or sort of looking at this in kind of a larger sociological context of sort of what this kind of movement means.
do you have an idea of what it means, or?
Well, clearly one of the things it means, it's a community. It has created something that really is focused on keeping people very connected to their community, their culture, their church. Depending on who you are, one comes first, one comes second. For some it's equal, whatever. But it has been amazingly savvy and effective. And it's gone through, some changes and struggles, and yet I think it has survived. I think it's come through it, and it has survived well, I think.
Seems to be thriving.
I think it'll continue. People want to replicate it. I know that, it's interesting. I don't know what Eris said, but in the East, unlike out here, in the East, there really are these smaller, tighter Greek communities, sometimes of people from just one area. And yet, in terms of the dancing, there hasn't been something as broad as FDF, and they're tending, I think, to really try to build and replicate it and grow it back east. So even though we look at the Siloi from back east and say, wow, when we were learning this, we didn't get exposed to those communities, they're also saying that as a way of really broadening it, they want to reproduce this there. So I think the experience of dancing back east was very different than here, and I think that there's some very rich stuff that goes on there, but I think that FDF has created much more richness here.
Okay.
And I think that the judging has had a big influence on that. I don't take credit for that. I think there are certain judges that have sort of gradually kind of, steered the ship a little bit, turned the ship a little bit in particular directions so that, for example, there was not so much of a focus on extreme choreography, clearly more of a focus on more research and authenticity. So there have been themes that have evolved over time with the judges, but I think the standards of what gets produced as Greek dance now have really changed.
That's wonderful. It sounds to me too like there's much more synergy between the two coasts now. They're starting to be
I think so. Yeah. And with all of the workshops in Greece, and then some of those teachers coming here and us coming there, and all of those relationships that have built.
I was going to ask you. The Preovolos family, do you want to say anything about Peter and the family and your relationship with them?
I, as the Kseni and not being involved on the board, I sort of keep to my own, keep to myself a little bit. So, I think that I don't have, really a close relationship with them. As a judge, we relied on Litsa unbelievably because she would be always there doing the data entry, and she was always amazing. We kind of saw the boys grow up at FDF.
Sure.
And Peter was a force.
Yeah.
I for a long time I couldn't think about Peter without thinking about Metropolitan Anthony. Because they really kind of ran it together and came together. So, yeah.
And do you have one favorite memory about your years at FDF? Or?
No, not at all. Not one. I mean, I love what happens after the competition, after the organized things where there's 5 different groups of musicians playing in the hallways, and there are hundreds of kids dancing. And I think that's the best part of FDF now for me.